The chair of the House Economics Committee is Labor MP Daniel Mulino, who joins me live now from Melbourne. We heard Jim Chalmers in the remarks that we've played to our viewers ahead of that interview going to air tonight on Sharry Markson's program about the Treasurer saying he's spoken to the review of the RBA and the talk, the way he described it, more structured accountability. Is that a good thing? And how would it work, Daniel?
Well, hi, Kieran, and good to see you. Well, look, we've just come out of a week where we had the Senate committee and then the House committee grilling the Reserve Bank Governor for 5 hours. So there is some accountability in the current system. I like to think that the House Economics Committee is a particularly robust part of that accountability. But look, I think one of the rationales for the review has always been to look at the ways in which the Reserve Bank communicates with the Australian people, to look at the different mechanisms of accountability and see if they could be strengthened. And that's a good thing to do. Now, it's obviously impossible for me to know what kinds of ways in which that review has suggested accountability could be improved, because it hasn't reported yet. But look, I think at the moment we have the House of Economics Committee, which does hold hearings twice a year. We have occasions on which the Reserve Bank Governor might give speeches and have Q&A after that. So I think one obvious way in which we might look at strengthening that accountability is for those Q&A sessions, if you will, to be more regular. So that's something which I think the review would be looking at.
And the timing of, say, that lunch with the bond traders, for example, happening before he appeared before your committee, is a good example of where they can mess up the timing. He said now that they're not going to have those lunches before the monetary statement is released. But it's an example of how the cart is before the horse on occasion, and it can lead to perceptions.
Well, so look, I asked the Governor a couple of questions around that, and look, I thought the optics were questionable. He provided some reassurance that he didn't think that bond markets had moved as a result of that discussion. But I think, look, a number of commentators, a number of people in the community have said that they thought it wasn't ideal. And I think the Governor and the bank itself have since changed their practices. Look, I think it's best if, following a decision on cash rates, he appear either before a press conference or give a speech and have a Q&A, or appear before a parliamentary inquiry first. And I think that's something that the bank itself has conceded.
Yeah, indeed. It's more transparent, and that's probably what the Treasurer is referring to with that structured accountability or measures to a similar sort of extent. When you look at the broader outlook, how many more rate rises are we looking at here?
Well, and one of the things that I, again, focused on in my questions was that in the bank's last statement, they flagged that they think that there's at least another couple. So that's something that was in the first paragraph of the most recent statement after the February decision. Look, I think the key thing is the bank has flagged that it thinks it's walking a narrow path. We've got inflation at elevated levels. Half to three quarters of the inflation that we're experiencing has been imported into Australia from overseas, just like in all advanced economies. This is a global phenomenon. What the bank is trying to do is to reduce that inflation, but to do so bearing in mind the impact that interest rate decisions have on unemployment and on aggregate output levels. And I think it's important that what the government does throughout the course of the next 6 to 12 months is to not make the RBA's job harder, which I think is an accurate reflection of where the budget strategy is at. And indeed, I think the RBA governor pretty clearly said that he feels as though the government's response to increased revenue as a result of resource prices being elevated and its actions to put downward pressure on energy prices has all been consistent with the RBA's overarching strategy.
Today we had the Teachers Federation president telling Sky News that the starting point for wage negotiations for teachers in New South Wales should be 5 to 7% annual pay rise. Obviously, people don't begrudge teachers a pay rise, but do the states also need to be cautious about this sort of thing right now when we've got such a red-hot economy?
Well, look, I don't want to comment on each individual wage negotiation in each workplace or sector, but I think it's worth noting that the Wage Price Index, which is the best single measure of wage movements across the economy as a whole, is still in the mid-threes and is expected to remain in the mid-threes for a while yet. And what the Reserve Bank Governor and other commentators have said is that if you look at the longer term, or if you look at inflation in that 2 to 3% band, plus productivity of, say, around 1%, having wages growth across the economy with a 4 in front of it is not itself problematic. So I think we've got to look at wages growth across the economy as a whole, and my reading of it, and which is consistent with what the Reserve Bank and other commentators have been saying, is that we're not yet at a point where one would consider wages growth to be any kind of problem.
So the wage price spiral, as it's known, do you see it now as, is it still a relevant concern, given, as you said, up to 3/4 of the inflation in our economy is imported due to bottlenecks globally or the Ukraine war?
Yes, a lot of inflation is imported, but there are still some demand side pressures, and that's really what the interest rate rises are aimed at. And so what we find coming out of COVID is that households have still considerable amounts of savings on their household balance sheets, some hundreds of billions of dollars still. And so what interest rate rises are intended to do for those households with mortgages, obviously, they feel direct consequences for their cash flow as a result of higher interest rates, and it puts downward pressure on aggregate demand. And ultimately what the Reserve Bank is trying to do is to put aggregate demand and supply in the economy into more balance so that inflation pressures are brought down. And their projections and Treasury's projections are broadly consistent in saying that they expect inflation will come down over the course of this year and next year, and hopefully by the end of next year it's getting close to the band that we're aiming for.